Hello, I'm Roger Watson. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Nurse Education in Practice. And in this short session, I'm going to talk to you about poor versus good writing style. In a later session, I'm going to look at common mistakes made in academic writing. Inevitably, there's going to be some overlap between these two sessions. There'll be some repetition, but repetition's never a bad thing if the information is good. So, first of all, to talk about style. I think that there's a myth about academic writing. Many people say that there's an academic writing style. I actually don't agree with this. I think that there are only two types of writing, good writing and bad writing. And whichever genre you're writing in, the style applies to that, whether you're writing academic articles or professional magazine articles or even book chapters or blogs. So they're really the same kind of rules or the same ideas about style apply to all these different kinds of writing. So I would strongly urge people not to think of there being an academic style of writing. This leads or tends to lead to very poor writing. It tends to lead to what I would call obscure and even obtuse writing, which is very hard for people to understand. Academics, and it's particularly bad for some reason amongst nursing academics, have a habit of writing for each other and even speaking to each other and communicating in a language which is not familiar to ordinary readers. However, you do have to write for not necessarily the lowest common denominator, but you do have to write in a way that is going to be understood by a very wide range of people. Now, there is a newspaper, an online newspaper in the West. It was begun in Australia, but it spread to other countries, including the UK and the United States, and it's even published in other languages, for example, in French. And I think it's also published in India in some of the languages there. And this newspaper describes itself as writing with academic rigour but journalistic flair, and I've written several articles for it. Now, they ask you to write your article as if you're writing it for an educated 16-year-old or an educated school leaver. So you're not writing it for a child. You're not trying to write it for somebody who's completely familiar with all maybe the technical details of your writing, but you're trying to write it in such a way that someone who's reasonably educated and is able to understand what you're saying will be able to understand it. So that's maybe where you should think about pitching in terms of style. However, it's often said about style that we should not try to develop one. There are some writers, for instance, writers of novels and of biographies, and I read a great many books, but there are some writers whose style I don't like. And it's difficult to explain exactly what I mean by that, but there are things in their writing which make it rather difficult to read what they're writing, and it also reminds me that person is writing it, and that's what some people say about style. The minute there's a style in the writing, it reminds the reader that someone is writing this, and we shouldn't do that. The reading should speak for itself, and it should be, again, I'll emphasize several times, easy to understand, and there shouldn't be any kind of style of writing getting in the way. So that always means using the simplest kind of language possible, using the plainest language possible, and writing it in a way that it's easy to digest and for people to understand, and of course to remember, or in the case of an academic paper, to read it, to understand it, and possibly to use your work and cite it in future. So don't, just to recap on that first section, don't develop the idea that there is an academic style of writing. I think that's a big mistake to do that, and many people do it. Also, don't try to develop your own style of writing As I say, there's only really two types of writing, good and bad, and you should try to develop good writing. So the problem with poor writing, for example, is that you're not sure what the writer is trying to say, and that's a real fault of a poor style of writing. Your writing should always be such that people can understand it. And I know, as an editor, in dealing with reviews, that a very common comment by reviewers is that they do not understand what the person has written. And of course, if the reviewer doesn't understand it, the ultimate reader might not understand it. And if the reviewer doesn't understand it, of course, at the very least, they may ask you to change it, but they may well reject your paper. So not being sure what the writer is trying to say is one aspect of poor style. So the way to overcome that is to write clearly, and if you've any doubts about what you've written, find someone else to take a look at it and ask them honestly, do you understand what I've said here? Or if you've difficulty in expressing something, which can sometimes be the case, especially if you're writing in a second language, which I think many of the people listening to this will be, in English, then you may have difficulty expressing certain things. I meant to say at the beginning that I'm assuming we're talking here about the use of English, because English is the universal language of science, despite other languages being very widely spoken. So I am talking here about the style of English writing. Another fault of poor style is that you keep having to stop and look up words in the dictionary. In other words, the types of words used are very unfamiliar and very complex. So again, try to use simple everyday words. There's no problem at all with doing that in academic writing. You can't use colloquialisms, obviously, but you can use common speech. So don't try to strive to find a more difficult word. That is always going to make your writing less easy to understand. Obviously, you run the danger then of using the wrong word. So make sure that you use simple words that you understand. Don't try to use words which you think might make you look clever. Writing, poor style of writing, often people reading it lose interest very early. If the style is hard to read, they will lose interest. Again, don't think about the ultimate reader of your article. If that happens to be the editor-in-chief or the editor or a reviewer, then you jeopardize the publication of your article. Don't use cliches. Now, cliches may be difficult to understand unless you're familiar with the English language, but cliches are common terms that are used in everyday speech. Things that you might hear if you're watching, for example, American television or British television, you might hear people saying in common speech. Again, it's a bit like colloquialisms or common speech. Don't use these things that newsreaders might say. So they're words that really are commonly used. They don't really mean anything. Things like standing shoulder to shoulder with, or towing the line, or sweeping under the carpet. There are lots of examples, and you will hear these in everyday English speech. They're not suitable. It's not that these are not understandable, it's just that they're completely unnecessary and can often be replaced by a single word. Obviously, the writing has to flow, and this is a real aspect of poor style, is writing that doesn't flow. So it's very important to make sure that it flows, that you join ideas together properly, that there's a logical organisation to the work, that one sentence leads to another, and that paragraphs are linked. And again, flow is difficult to teach and to point to specifically, and it's something that you would learn as you develop your writing style. But again, giving your work to someone else to read would always help to see if it flows properly. One trick, of course, is to end one paragraph by introducing the next one, and to start the next paragraph by reflecting back on the previous one. So those are some of the aspects of poor style. The ways to overcome this are to try and make the writing as short and succinct as possible. So if you can lose words and remove words from it, you should always do that, and that comes with good editing. Try to make it simple, as I say, make it direct, and almost try and make it relevant to the reader. Try and think of who might be reading this. And of course, with an academic article, the first reader will be the editor-in-chief, then it might be a handling editor, and then a reviewer. So you've got to think about those people while you're writing it. Don't write to please yourself. Think and realise that somebody else is going to be reading this. So that's a sort of bridging section in this talk between poor writing style and aspects of good writing style. I have some points about good writing style which I'm going to share now as well. So specifically, writing short sentences, they're much easier to read. Don't make all your sentences too short, because in English it's nice to have a flow between long and short, but if a sentence covers 4 or 5 lines perhaps, it's probably too long. Try to find some way of breaking it up. I'll talk in a later presentation about actually writing, and we've talked about this to some extent already in the 4 rules of writing. Try to use the active voice. So don't say, for example, the experiment was done. Say who did it. Try to be direct in your language, and also active writing, as opposed to passive writing, always makes things shorter because it uses fewer words. And one way to be active and also to use fewer words, and it's perfectly acceptable within academic writing these days, and very much a point of style that most academic publishers like, is to use the first person, I and we. So again, instead of saying the experiment was done, we did the experiment, or I collected the data, I analysed the data, and so forth. Some journals may not like that, and if they don't, you'll have to change it, but it would never be a reason for you to be rejected. But I would always try to develop a style of writing that uses the first person. I know that major publishers like Wiley, Elsevier and others far prefer it. It's far more clear and direct. So again, I've said, write for your reader. Don't write to please yourself. Don't write to amuse yourself. Write for the reader. Give clear instructions, give clear signposts throughout your writing. Next I'm going to discuss this, having discussed this, following on from the previous point, these sort of things. Learn to use these sort of joining phrases that not only point your reader through the work or through the sections of your work, they also help it to be joined together and to flow. Don't overuse them, obviously, because it'll add to the words, but there's nothing wrong with trying to join concepts together. A reader should know where they are. They shouldn't have to work and think about that. Of course, using headings and using lists is also very good, and if you're writing an academic article, the headings will be given to you. The headings and subheadings will be part of the recognised or prescribed structure of the paper. Make use of these, but also try to use subheadings within them. So for example, in a methods section of a paper, you could start off with the subheading design, and then you could do data collection, and then data analysis, and then ethical aspects, something like that. You can use your own subheadings. There's nothing wrong with that. It breaks the text up. I think it's a really important point of style, and it prevents your reader from having to read long sections without a break. And listing is good as well. Don't overuse any of these sort of mechanisms or devices, but listing is quite good. If you've got to make 3 or 4 points, then list them. Don't write them in a sentence. Put them down with bullet points. It draws attention to them, makes them very easy to read, and actually makes them quite easy to remember. And in order to be able to do these things, they don't come naturally, they don't come easily. I would say that to write with a good style, whatever that style may be, you should write often. The more often you write, the better. Don't just think that you've got to sit down and write academic papers. Try to write other things as well, and all of these things will help you to develop your writing and to develop your style. So just to recap, before I finish, there's not really any such thing as an academic writing style. There is only good writing and bad writing. Bad writing is usually writing where the style of the writer is recognised, so try not to develop a style. Try to write clearly and concisely with short sentences, and to make your work flow as much as possible from the beginning to the end logically. making use of headings, subheadings, lists, and any of the other aspects that you're allowed to use in an academic paper. And my final point is, do write in the first person. I hope you found that useful. Once again, thank you very much for listening.